Aperture is important to wildlife photographers because it allows key elements of the animal to either be in or out of focus. So whether you're trying to get multiple animals in focus at the same time, or if you want to emphasize a specific bird by giving it that blurred background effect, Aperture is what's going to set you apart. What's up, Safari Nation, and welcome back to another wildlife photography tutorial. So you want to know more about Aperture and how it can improve your wildlife images. Well, to understand that, first we need to explain what Aperture is. Basically, the aperture is your camera's pupil. Similar to how our pupils constrict and dilate in different light conditions, you can use Aperture to control how much light is sent through to your camera's sensor. Aperture is indicated on your camera as f-stop. A lower f-stop or aperture setting indicates a wider pupil, and a higher f-stop setting indicates a more constricted pupil. So the lower your f-stop, the more light it lets in to the sensor, and the higher the f-stop, the less light it allows in. When it comes to photography as a whole, there's a trifecta of settings that is extremely important to understand, and it's known as the exposure triangle. How you balance your aperture, ISO, and shutter speed settings all play a role in what the end result of a shot will be. And they are all connected, so if you change the one setting, it affects the efficiency of the other two. I'll be posting videos on ISO and shutter speed in the coming weeks, so stay tuned to see how it all ties together. But for now, let's focus on aperture. So what aperture settings should you use? Your aperture setting is something that you're constantly going to change to create different looks and feels for your images. Essentially, your aperture controls how much of your frame will be in focus. I'm sure you've heard of the term depth of field. Take this shot for example. The focus point is on the grassbird's eye. The depth of field controls how much of the image in front of the chosen focus point, as well as how much behind it will be in focus. To get that shallow depth of field or blurred background look, you need a wide f-stop setting. So f4 or f5.6, or even lower if your camera setup allows it. But to get a much wider depth of field or to have more of your frame in focus, you're going to need a much higher f-stop. So anything from f9, f12 and even up if you can push it that far. So before setting your f-stop or your aperture setting, first ask yourself these two things. One, how much light do I have to work with? And two, how much of my shot do I actually want in focus? Most wildlife photographers suggest keeping your aperture settings as wide as possible to create that shallow depth of field or blurred background look, emphasizing your subject and making it kind of pop out of the frame. And when I started wildlife photography, that's exactly what I did. But over time, I've come to learn that it's not always that simple when you're in the field. Like taking a photo of this leopard tortoise with the aperture wide open, doesn't he create the blurred background? But the back end of the tortoise isn't in focus. My depth of field was too shallow. If I pushed my f-stop to about f8 instead of f5.6, the background would have still had that blurry effect, and the backside of the tortoise would have been in sharp focus as well, creating a much better looking image overall. Photos such as this crowned lapwing, for example, sitting with a busy background works well when you use a wide aperture, such as f5.6. It gives it that shallow depth of field and blurs out the busy background, drawing all the attention to the bird itself. And when you're photographing a scenario such as this, where you want majority of the seals to be in focus, use a wider aperture such as f9 to make sure that you achieve that. Just remember, a lower f-stop number indicates a wide open aperture, and a higher f-stop number indicates a much narrower and constricted aperture. So in low light, when you want to use a high aperture setting, you're gonna have to pump up your ISO to keep the shutter speed fast enough to make sure you get that image nice, crisp and clear. Because if the shutter speed is too slow, it's going to come out blurry and unusable. When it comes to the depth of field, there are basically three things that affect it. The focal length of your lens, the distance to your subject, and the actual aperture setting that you'll be shooting at. Now, in doing some research for this video, I've come across some people using different formulas and various apps and all of that to calculate the actual depth of field for the specific shot you want to take. But as you know, with wildlife photography, you don't have a lot of time when you want to take photos. Most of the time you have to guess your settings and shoot away. So my best advice to you would be to just get out in the field, use your camera, just practice the various settings and get used to changing your aperture. Learn how your camera body and lens works together, and eventually you'll figure out what aperture settings works best for you. And make sure you force yourself into different scenarios, like photographing animals in the sharp midday sun, snapping shots of birds in a poorly lit forest or shaded patch, or even just photographing the various birds in your backyard at different times of the day. And remember, practice makes perfect. The more you get in the field and play around with the different settings and just take photos of wildlife, the better you'll get at judging the exact settings you need for that perfect shot. Let me know in the comments below what camera setup you use and what your fail-safe aperture setting is. For me, I use Canon's EOS 77D with the 100 to 400mm Mark II lens, and I generally shoot on f7.1 or f8. Thanks for watching, guys. Hit the subscribe button to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode on ISO and how it affects the exposure triangle. And hit up this side to catch more tips on photography. But for now, get out there, enjoy nature, and just take photos. Cheers.